Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Kwok. I want to thank you all for being here. I'll be your moderator. We're going to have two panels. The first panel here are the survivors. And so I'll just introduce Mr. Lee, who you saw in the video, and his translator, Hannah. Thank you. And then Michael Zhu over there, and Justin Go. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And I'm just going to, the documentary was a way for the task force, the anti-Asian violence task force, to record and to remember as a document of our time. Because one of the things that we found when we started doing the work was that there was an invisibility and a lack of memory about American history, about what had happened. And we thought among one of the projects we did was this. And this project is, I think, very heavy. But we're here to talk about where the survivors are now and about what we can do as a community together to remember and to make things better. So I'm going to start off by asking Michael. We heard your story in the documentary, but you're here. Bring us to where you are now, today.
Okay, yeah, I would say there's a lot of mixed feelings, duality about where I stand. Obviously, what happened to me is statistically very unfortunate. It was pretty intense. I think that night the local ABC7 tweeted that I was likely to die based on what they heard at the hospital. But hopefully I look fine now, and I made a pretty good 90% recovery. So I'm very thankful for the surgeons for doing their job very well. And thinking about where I am, I think I've told a lot of people that what happened to me gives you, like it would to a lot of people, a different perspective on life. You understand life is short and precious. And I certainly started saying, yes to a lot more things and experiences after that. But at the same time, when I went full-time back to work, and, there was one day I was back on my third conference call, and I tried to figure out why, stock is down 2%. You were like, oh, things are very back to normal now. And that's also true. And that's actually kind of a blessing. The one thing that's not a mixed feeling is I'm very thankful for my friends and family, and especially my wife, for supporting me through this. Actually, when I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, we were in the middle of moving apartments, closing on a new purchase. So my wife had to take time out of her busy job, in addition to visiting me and taking care of me at the hospital. She had to take care of that process, pack us up, do the renovations and all that. So, that was really, really important. And that summer, we decided to get married in a very private ceremony. So, for her to decide to commit at that point in time meant a lot to me, and it still does.
It's so everyday life is precious too. Once you go back to normality, that was a blessing too. It's great to hear. I had the chance to visit Mike and his wife at the Nani Dance Company, where she serves on the board, and that also is something that that you guys have. Is that new, or has that been around for a while?
The dance company's been around for many years. Mostly Jen's involvement started about a year and a half ago.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to turn to Mr. Lee, and ask him. He has some prepared remarks, and I think he's going to bring us up to now, as to letting us know where he is now. Mr. Lee.
Thank you for inviting me to very meaningful event for Asian American right tonight. It was over 3 years from Christina's pass away, but I eat, work, sleep every day, same as before. So it is bothering me every day, every time. Many Asian American people, especially women, were dead or injured by hate Asian crimes during pandemic period. Here are victims of crime and their family, friends together tonight. We are on the same boat, therefore, we should do something to reduce this kind of tragedy. It is unity ourselves and raise the voice to New York City mayor officials and police like you must do your job well to protect the citizens. Also, we have to do something to reduce social conflict. In order to do that, we need more tolerances, more charities, and the actions for this purpose. Let's do it together from now, not tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. One of the things that you talked about in the documentary was about you're trying to have the homeless shelter be renamed for Christina Yuna Lee. Do you know what's happening with that now or what's going on?
The case is pending now because last October, New York City mayor and many officers, including some scandal. So, the contact person, he was resigned also. So we cannot, contact anybody now. So I expect, coming November for new election, when the mayor, comes out, we're going to contact the mayor to process, the case again.
We were talking about this before, and it's very interesting. And Mr. Lee was saying how, we're all New Yorkers, most of us here, right, about sort of what was happening with the investigations with Mayor Adams, and then with a lot of people around Mr. Adams, particularly his Asian American advisors, and they got wrapped up in the scandal. And in the process of that, sort of local issues of, that we're dealing with, that we're following up with, that we have trying to get the mayor's attention, kind of comes off the table. And I think that, I think Mr. Lee, you would like to have that be back on the table for the next mayor, and to see if there's something that we as a community could rally around that issue as something that we could carry the flag on. And thank you. So I'm going to turn to Justin Go, who also has prepared some remarks that will take us to where he is right now. Mr. Go.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thanks to the Asian Society for inviting me to be on this panel with Michael Zhu and Mr. Lee here. My condolences to both of them for the attacks that they've endured, to Mr. Lee's daughter and Michael, of course, to himself. I'm Michelle Alyssa Go's father, who was murdered back in January of 2022 in the Times Square station. Let me begin my remarks. Today is Tuesday, June 24th of 2025. It's been almost 3.5 years since my family lost her daughter, Michelle Alyssa Go. Her self-confessed murderer, Marshall Simon, languishes in Kirby Psychiatric Medical Center since that fateful day. Why? Because he is still deemed mentally unfit to face trial for murder too. My family and I do not know if we will ever get to see Marshall Simon tried and to stand trial for murdering Michelle. Perhaps I should count my blessings that he is not on the street to harm other people, other Asian Americans, especially Asian American women. I wrote an editorial a year after Michelle's death in the New York Times. Michelle was murdered by a homeless, schizophrenic man who should not have ever been on the streets wandering New York subways and streets. This horrible act is intolerable, unacceptable, and should never, ever be allowed to be repeated. But strident voices in newspapers and media continue to divide us and pit us against each other. Both the left and the right are guilty of this fear-mongering. Instead of offering solutions to bring us together, they force us to take sides in a likely Pyrrhic victory, where no one wins except for death and for heartache. I want Michelle to be remembered for who she was and what she did, and not just for the way she died. Death by subway train by a murderous repeat criminal is just not acceptable. Why psychiatric doctors released Marshall Simon to the streets to fulfill his evil predilections, I will never understand. Years earlier, he had vowed to kill a woman by subway train someday, yet they still released him on his own recognizance to take his pills and see his doctor. In response, Marshall Simon simply disappeared into the mist of New York City. Was it the lack of funding for beds and staff and attention that forced the hands of the psychiatric staff and allowed his release? My family and I will never forget this horrible ending for Michelle's life. We still miss her funny laugh, her generosity, her cross-country flights to see family and friends, even though we knew she worked long hours on various projects. Michelle always made it a point to remember family events, special occasions like races or birthdays. She would show up unexpectedly or make a phone call. Sometimes she would send cupcakes or flowers or toys to add to the occasion. After grueling works that week, she found some work-life balance by traveling. She was continually searching for the perfect beach, and she learned more of other people and places. Even as she worked professionally with company executives in mergers and acquisitions, she spent personal public service time mentoring women and helping the homeless at the New York Junior League. How ironic that she met the end of her life at the hands of a homeless person. In my New York Times editorial, I asked that the streets and subways of New York City be made safer for everyone. No one should suffer murder in their family history, as Sungkon Lee and I and Michael and too many other families have experienced. In response, New York Mayor Eric Adams and Governor Kathy Hochul had door barriers installed on many subway station platforms at Times Square, 14th Street, and at Sutphin Boulevard in Queens, following Michelle's murder. Guardrails have been placed at other stations to prevent other people from falling or being pushed onto the tracks. Involuntary removal of homeless persons who cannot care for themselves and who threaten others was started. Timing and funding for more safety measures are being considered across other subway stations. These are welcome additions to transit safety in New York City. In 2022, following Michelle's death, then U.S. Representative Carolyn Maloney from the Upper West Side promulgated a Michelle Alyssa Go Act to increase funding for staff and resources for psychiatric hospitals beyond the current limit of 16 beds. Dan Goldman, again from the Upper West Side, took over that effort and is awaiting the pivotal moment for the bill to succeed in the U.S. Congress. Currently, there is bilateral support for this act. My family and I are so grateful for the support and consideration we have received and witnessed from people across New York and around the world. Donations have been made in Michelle's name to the New York Junior League just up the street here and to the Asian Law Alliance in California. Rallies were held in Michelle's name and against anti-Asian violence in New York, San Francisco, and other places. We thank all those attendees for their presence, their voice, and their support for Asian Americans, especially for women who continue to be attacked. Michelle's last employer, Deloitte, created two $500,000 scholarships to help other women attend school without financial burden. And these were at NYU's School of Business and at UCLA. Those were Michelle's two schools. Since 2022, my family has met many worthy women poised to make this country proud and better. My daughter Michelle would have been proud if she had a chance to meet these capable women. 2 months ago, about April 27th, Brian Lair from KNYC led an NPR discussion about major issues in today's primary election for a Democratic candidate. Michelle's 2022 shoving death was mentioned in light of the major issue of safety. Many New Yorkers saw Michelle as one of their own in her life and her work and her public service. Support and consideration for safety in light of her tragic death are a fitting legacy for how she lived. She was just one person trying to do her best in life for herself and for others. I hope her life's work and service serve as examples to be remembered and replicated by others in New York and elsewhere. Perhaps there should be a Michelle Alyssa Go Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Go. You know, and I think one of the things that I want to sort of reach back out to that you talked about is the Melissa Go Act, which was promulgated by Carolyn Maloney when she was still in Congress, but has still sort of been carried on by Dan Goldman.
Yes.
And that act, can you tell us a little bit about what that act would do if it became law?
Yes, the Michelle Alyssa Go Act was started by Carolyn Maloney. It's part of the Energy and Commerce Committee, if you can believe that. But that's where Medicare and Social Security is worked through, and as in committee. What the Michelle Alyssa Go Act wants to do is that there's a limitation right now of 16-bed institutions, and other than that, people have to be turned away. So this increased funding would allow institutions with more than 16 beds to have services, therapy, and treatment for the mentally ill, and that the funding would be increased so that the terms of service for the mentally ill would go beyond a limitation of 18 months. The bill is yet to be submitted to the Congress because the moment to be considered is not opportune given all the other things happening in the current Trump administration.
So I just wanted to tab those two things for you guys and for us as an audience to sort of latch on to, both for the renaming of a shelter, which would happen at the New York City level, local level, and then that bill at the federal level. Both would be sort of some type of work that you can engage in a community together to deal with some of the issues that have arisen out of this. And there's so many, of course, but these are two very specific things that, you know, can be positives that we want to talk about: community engagement with electeds, with the process, being a part of it, having solutions, having some type of memory or a marker. And maybe with that, Michael, if I could go back to you to talk about, you know, what good of it, and you've talked about some of it already that has come out of it for you, but what else, you know, have you seen in your life or that you can point to as good that's coming out of this trauma that you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to highlight the work that Albany has done, and you know how they've helped me in this process. You know, whether something is a hate crime or not, from my experience, the district attorney's office has a lot of discretion about how they pursue cases and what kind of, you know, sentencing recommendations they have. So in my case, for the first year and a half, the assistant district attorney in my case, you know, said all the right things. She said, this is a very serious crime. We have all the evidence we need. 15 years is the maximum sentence, and this is, you know, she said, I think that's what we're going to go for unless we learn something very, very different, right? And then, you know, suddenly, a year and a half later, she called me and said, we've sat down and, you know, now we're talking 8 to 10 years. That's the settlement we're likely to offer the other side. And their lawyer has actually requested that the charge be downgraded from attempted murder to assault. And, you know, that was around the time I was introduced to Albany, and they told me I can do things like make a victim impact statement, which is what I did. And, you know, I told the ADA in charge of my case, you know, what happened, right? I mean, her tone changed very suddenly. Now she started saying things like, we never know what can happen in court. We don't know what the judge will do. But here you had the guy on video camera. He confessed within 2 hours, and there were 3 witnesses, so the case seems impossible to lose. And then she said, well, you know, if you don't have to testify in court, that will save you a traumatic experience. And I said, thank you, but I will definitely testify in court because I want to prevent him from doing this again, right? And, you know, someone from Albany told me he worked in an office and, you know, his take is that, you know, she was told by someone, one of her superiors, to basically take this, you know, get this case done and over with. And I also asked her, you know, is there going to be anything done about my, you know, the person that attacked me, his history of mental illness and escalating violence, which he definitely had, just like a lot of, you know, the other 2, you know, murderers here. And she said, oh, there's actually going to be 5 years post-release supervision. But that actually means nothing because it means, you know, when he gets out of jail, somebody will call him. But if he ignores them or doesn't answer, then nothing happens, right? So, you know, ultimately, when I made my victim impact statement, I think, you know, I was able to get them to get the maximum they could, which ended up being 7 years. That realistically means the person will probably be released in 7 years. You know, they did charge it as attempted murder, which is important to me because, you know, assault just sounds like he punched me, right? You know, if this person ever gets back into the system, I think it's important that the next ADA or the next judge realizes that this is a person that's capable of murder, and so they did at least do that. And I, you know, I would say what I want to come back to is when I made my impact statement, there was a significant group from Albany, you know, standing behind me, and I think that made a powerful statement and visual image to the judge. And, you know, even though my outcome is what it is, I think if that happens more and more, and I want to support that, and that's why I want to participate here. And I'm, you know, very glad they made this documentary. I think hopefully that will make, you know, the next judge and the next ADA think harder about are they doing all that they can to prevent outcomes like this.
Yeah, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone again for participating in the documentary. It's not easy, you know, to share your story, but by sharing your story with us, and then we can help you and then make sure that the eyes of the community, like in the sentencing, and I want to shout out Elaine Chu, whose idea was court watching, that the eyes of the community is watching, and where they're watching, you know, the process, I'll tell you that from where we're sitting, things are different. They happen differently because the community was engaged and they were watching and they were paying attention. And that is really, I think, in many ways, political power. We don't generally think of it as political power, like to deal with prosecutions and things like that, but that's all part of the ball, you know, and we really need to be engaged. And by being engaged and watching what's happening and then shifting things through political participation, community participation, showing up in court can really make a difference. And I think that, you know, I really want to highlight that, you know, Albany has been doing this work since 1993, at least, you know, with the helping Asian victims. Marilyn Go was there, Lyson, Rocky. You know, we've been doing it since before Young's time and before my time. And when that time came again with COVID, we were really glad to have a platform where we could come together and we could just help and do something. So maybe I would time for one question if there's a yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. And then sounds good. Anybody, do you have anything else? Okay, thank you so much to the survivors. I appreciate it. Glenn Magpantay and Jennifer Wu to come up. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Glenn? Glenn is being polite. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Glenn.
Charged forward. Okay.
All right. Yes, let's do both sides.
Around you and
yeah. No, thanks. For Chris. Okay, sounds good. So we have two great people here to talk more about the work, and we're going to continue the discussion. Jennifer Wu, a lawyer for many of the victims in this era, including Mr. Go. You know, and Glenn Magpantay, who was a longtime civil rights lawyer in our community, and also now a commissioner with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have, as a community, Asian American community, experienced a trauma, and in many ways, there's also a process of forgetting, both within the community because they just want to be done with it, but where are we going and where are we head to? Maybe I'll start with Glenn and then I'll come back to Jen.
Actually, I'm going to go, where have we been? The first bill that I actually worked on at the federal level was actually the Federal Hate Crimes Act, and that was in 1988. The first state bill that I worked on was the New York State Bias-Related Violence Bill that was actually passed by signed by George Pataki in 2000. The federal bill was signed by President Obama. Hate crimes is nothing new in this country. And we were just chatting earlier that when you have a discrete and insular minority group that begins to rise in power and influence, there is a countervailing moment of which pushes back on that pressure. The change that we saw in Flushing from being a Jewish enclave to a major Asian American enclave was done. And Senator John Lee will tell this story of how those elected officials were highly hostile towards the Asian American community. When I joined the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, we actually did a report on anti-Asian violence. And the commission is a bipartisan commission made of 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. We advise the president and the Congress on equal opportunity and hate crimes. I'm sorry, equal opportunity and civil rights. We have jurisdiction over the Hate Crimes Act. And I told the story of how I was the survivor of a hate crime for being gay from 25 years ago and was a victim of a hate crime for being Asian from 25 months ago. These issues continue to persevere. I'm so delighted that Jennifer Wu was one of our witnesses, that we have Mr. Go's story to document why we need greater enforcement of hate crimes laws in this country, why we need changes, and why our community needs to be recognized and treated with all the dignity and fairness that we deserve.
Thank you, Jen. So where do we go?
Yeah, so I think that so much of our lives, especially growing up, my parents are immigrants, I'm from New Jersey, was that it was safer to stay silent than it was to speak out. That silence was safety. My parents grew up in a very safe neighborhood, but they actually never opened the front door. They were in suburban New Jersey, and whether it was the police or a neighbor or a Girl Scout, they felt that they did not want to be blamed if anything bad happened, so they would not open their front door. And my sister and I were taught to hide in the closet or under a bed as soon as the doorbell rang, even if it was like the UPS truck or mail truck. And I didn't know until I got to high school that that was not normal. Right? I just thought that that's what you did, and no one opened the doorbell. And they had like 3 deadbolts on it, and they wouldn't open the door. And I say that because I think that anti-Asian hate is not new. It's as American as it is un-American. But we as a community sometimes stay silent about it because we are safer, and I don't fault anyone, we are safer by not speaking out. So for example, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you have been the victim of some sort of harassment because of race? Just show of hands. How many of you have reported that to police? Show of hands. How many of you have actually testified and kind of gone through the prosecution towards the end, and gotten to maybe just start with like just going through trial, first of all, before you get to verdict? And you can just see by the show of hands that we as a community tend to underreport. And I know that personally because when my children and I experienced hate crimes during the pandemic, when people would call us names and we reported it, the police would say, well, it seems like it could be an Asian thing, but do you really want to make a police report? And my kids were hungry, so we went home, right? And I later was like, maybe I should have reported it. This is before we worked on, kind of the ABNY reports. So the Asian American Bar Association of New York wrote 2 reports documenting the rise of hate crimes. And that is so important to Chris's point of where are we going? We cannot get funding for these issues unless we document and we bear witness. And in order to document and bear witness, we need everybody. It's not just me, it's not just Chris, and I know Chris can pull like many all-nighters on this, Young Chen, obviously Grace V, who's here, is on everything in the task force. So many members are here. We all worked many nights on this, but every single one of us has to be willing at some level to speak up in order to protect each other. Judge Go, I see over there. And that's a really challenging thing. And I remember having worked on many of these hate crimes that almost every victim I worked with did not want to have their kind of face or name in the paper. So the consequence of that was that I, who was a patent lawyer, who was a partner at Paul Weiss, would allow my face and my name to be in the paper on behalf of the victims. An example was the Yonkers woman, Filipino woman, who was beaten 125 times and survived. Her name never made it to the paper because she didn't want her name to be in the paper, so my face was out there. And even my own parents who are immigrants thought that was a bad idea. They thought that I would be a target and they didn't want me out there. And so I would just give that some thought. And so I very much understand the dynamic of not wanting to be out there on this. But on the flip side, there's strength in numbers and there's courage in being a community. And it's not to say that anyone deliberately doesn't speak up. It's not to say that anyone doesn't raise their hand to want to report. But we all have busy lives. And I think that maybe sometimes in our community, there's a preference to, kind of we're trained to kind of be safe by being quiet. Like my parents would say, don't be noisy in the car because it'll be safer when I drive. So it was safer to be quiet because they wouldn't bother my dad when he was going on a long road trip. Or if how many of you have been to a restaurant and gotten the wrong meal? And maybe, you don't want to tell the waitress, I didn't get the right meal. These are all little tiny things. But overall, what I would say is that kind of speaking your voice and pointing out what you think is wrong is really important. And we as a community are perceived as kind of, bearing it.
And one of the things that we found during the course of anti-Asian, that COVID era, is that, the DAs and the police would say, oh, the Asians aren't reporting or they're not finishing it. So we really engaged in that process as a task force, really focused on it for 1 or 2 years. And really like a year into COVID, a lot of the people that were like victims of these harassments or crimes would begin to report. But that's when we located another issue, which was how the police or the DAs would receive that information or not care about it. And that was a really interesting sort of turn where we're like, okay, yeah, that's part of the problem. Asians don't report. But it was so much more complicated, and and it takes so much more of the resources of the task force to like turn that dial to say you got to go talk and you got to say it 10 times, like you just have to do it. And that was a learning that I think the Asian American community actually did sort of go through. But then what we found was that with the DAs, like Michael sort of noted, then there was a certain type of like seriousness, and then it becomes like grinding through the process of just another case. But we're saying, hey, there's a community harm here that needs to be addressed beyond the individual, and that needs to be addressed. And as Asian Americans, we found that to be lacking on some level, but which we found also then that the eyes watching and people speaking up can really make a difference there. And one of the things that we did out of the task force was to advocate for changes to the hate crime laws. And one of the direct things that came out of the task force was an expansion of hate crime laws in New York State, 16 additional categories, which we now be eligible for hate crimes. Grace Lee, Assemblywoman in the New York State Assembly, was the co-sponsor. Some in the Asian American community, there was a debate about hate crime laws, Glenn. So can you talk about that a little bit? Where do you see that sort of debate and how that hate crime laws, enforcement of that as an answer?
Oh, Chris. I was not. So when Congresswoman Grace Meng put the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act up, which basically created funding opportunities, a mechanism for reporting, had an alternative to incarceration, that if somebody was convicted of a hate crime, instead of going to jail, they can go out and supervise release, they can do community service or learn about the community that they victimized. And actually, these people are going to get out someday. Who do you think you're going to blame? It might be better to do the education and the sensitivity training so that they actually understand the community. A number of Asian American groups, I was not included in this, but protested that. Abolitionists, we don't want to see more hate crimes. Like, it's all black people who's attacking Asians. And, we have to do something about the incarceration of black folk. And I do understand that there is problems in our criminal justice system in America where African Americans are disproportionately affected, but buying into the myth that most of the hate crimes were committed by African Americans. That might have been in the media, but we had data that showed most of the hate crimes against Asians were committed by white people. The other aspect that I took issue with some aspects of our community is that, to do another hate crime law is another form of criminalization. I think they called it the carceral state. And it comes out of this abolitionist movement. And again, I believe in the goals, but I'm like, read the bill. The bill actually creates an opportunity to have restorative justice. But people got caught up in the messages. They didn't. It's one of the reasons why I like lawyers, because we at least read our stuff. And actually, no, if you're going to criticize something, let's do it with substance, with a basis. I mean, we've disagreed on a number of issues, but we understand those disagreements. Don't just go by what the latest soundbite is. And it was somewhat humiliating for me and for Congresswoman Meng to be putting out a bill to defend our community that members of the Asian American community protested. And I think that was a challenge that we had to deal with. Although the bill did pass and it had Republican and Democratic support, so I am proud of that bill.
I was going to say that none of the victims I work with reported any of their kind of events as a federal hate crime, as I think you know. And from the state level, I think just to make explicit what Chris is saying, in order for it to be a hate crime in New York, hate must be the sole or kind of wholly, it must be wholly part of the motivating factor. And just like you don't know why you love someone, you don't know why you hate someone. Right? It's really hard for a perpetrator to state clearly, other than the Yonkers case that we worked on, that it was like clear that they're attacking them because they're Asian. It's really hard to, like, I don't say to my husband, I love you because you're Asian, right? I also don't, perpetrators don't say, I love, you know, I hate you because you're Asian. And so in my view, and this was kind of put before Governor Hochul by Sungkon Kim, and after I spoke with him, it's like, let's change the law. The other thing is that hate crimes are not a standalone crime. Right, so there's a penalty enhancement, and I think Mike made reference to this, but how much does it matter when you really, it matters to the community for sure, but if it was a standalone crime, maybe we take it more seriously. And then just the third point is that I'm kind of very involved in kind of allyship work with all communities experience hate crimes, like Black church burnings, anti-Semitism is on the rise right now, anti-Muslim crimes certainly is on the rise right now. But for a lot of those crimes, there's a specific thing that identifies it as a hate crime. So if someone is basically drawing a swastika on a synagogue, you know it's an anti-Semitic hate crime. If it's a Black church burning, you know it's anti-Black. If it's anti-Muslim, it's someone, you know, took someone who's wearing a Sikh something and then they attack them. But our hate crime is our face. And oftentimes our face is not enough to be the sole or kind of wholly motivating factor. And so it's not challenged as a hate crime. And I've had many, many prosecutors tell me that this was a crime against women because it's primarily Asian women who are being attacked. And somehow that doesn't fall within the rubric. So for example, Guang Ma, the grandmother who was attacked in Queens, they treated it like an elderly crime, even though it seemed to me like it was an anti-Asian hate crime because some of the things that possibly were said. But they said, well, she was targeted because she was sweeping the street and because she was old. And so it was treated as an elderly crime. So I feel like maybe our identifying factors are face, but there's no like specific thing that identifies the anti-Asian, and therefore it's hard to kind of get that charged as a hate crime.
So that's one of the issues that we as a task force really discussed all throughout. And we're working on conceptualizing an answer or a suggestion about how to deal with that issue. And part of it, once again, circles back to engagement, back to me pointing out sort of things we can do at the state level, the federal level, but how does engagement deal with how people would understand in the whole community what a hate crime is? We understand that a hate crime with a noose goes back to America's history of lynching, because really hate crimes in America begins with African Americans and what they experienced, right? We understand that swastika in a Jewish temple is anti-Semitism because the Jewish community has made sure that we understand that as a community. For Asian Americans, spa workers in Atlanta, what happened there? We don't understand that. It's just women, right? No, it's so much more complicated, but we as a community have not conceptualized that answer about how gender and race work together, particularly for Asian women, right? That's really complicated. And we need to teach ourselves and then teach the larger community. And, you know, that's also part of the intellectual work that we're developing out of the task force that we want to do, because we think that's so important. The Chinese restaurant, in many ways, places are like signifiers. Like, you know, it's not as sexy as the church or a temple, but the Chinese restaurant in many ways represent like the Chinese person, you know, and so like, and I think we need to be able to articulate that. And because eventually DAs will make decisions that affect our community based on that. And those are some of the ideas that we've, you know, spun out of really the decades of work that begins with Vincent Chin for the Asian American movement, continues in Albany with in the early 90s and until today. So Anything else before maybe we go to questions?
So I just want to say, for everyone who never reported a hate crime, you can tell me. No, and I'm serious, right? No, and I actually do this, and I do this with voting violations. I actually have the statutory authority to refer cases to the Department of Justice. I can't force them to do anything, but at least I can do it, and I can make sure that it is documented. So I'll give
Glenn
you
has
my
Stephen
card.
Miller on his.
I will do everything that
dial.
I can. I mean, in college, somebody wrote faggot on my dorm, and I reported to the police officer, and the police officer, the campus safety, and this is Stony Brook, you know, laughed. He said, "Why are you reporting it?" And I advised him on like how the State University of New York system on aggravated harassment actually worked and how it was inclusive of sexual orientation. I had to do that work with a police officer. And of course, this is like the late 1980s. But if any of you know that Abney is here, I am here. We will do everything we can to support you. Not everything will result in fairness and success, but at least to have our stories documented and at least for someone to say something so that we have the evidence to say why we need to advance and speak up means a lot.
I was gonna say I'm gonna report one now, which is we're representing someone who's undocumented in New York, out of Flushing, and they took away him but not his wife, and he got put in a detention center still there near Houston. And when the judge came to hear bond, they said, well, if he's a Chinese exotic, I'm not gonna let him out because they're dangerous. And so that's an example of an INS judge, right, saying things right now. And look, you know, we can differ on immigration, legal or not, but the idea that certain people are treated differently because of their race and the country of origin while they're in detention is sort of a kind of a slippery slope in my view.
There's so much in there. Find an issue, engage in it, fight at the local level. It can make a difference. The next time you look up, you just never know what change you can make when you're engaged in it. So, questions?
You mentioned the hate crime laws were expanded. What exactly was expanded?
6 like additional in New York state law. Only certain enumerated categories are eligible for hate crimes enhancement, which means that they make it more serious and you have greater penalties. And so if you're not accused of one of those crimes, there is no hate crimes enhancement possible.
So like if you were like a gang of people doing something, it couldn't be enhanced, but if you're an individual, you could be. So I thought it was more, you know, with all due credit to the people who worked on it, it was more like gap filling. The laws didn't evolve in a way that made sense. I see it as an expansion of hate crime law, but only in a way that it made sense. I don't see it as kind of creating more opportunities for prosecutions of hate crimes because the standard still remains, has to be, you know, kind of solely or wholly the motivating factor. Hate.
I'll also tell you, you're right, I agree. I'll also tell you the way we got that, like, was we worked with Alvin Bragg. We worked, their office got behind it. They didn't take 95% of our ideas, but they took, you know, part of it. And that's part of participation in government and working and not getting every victory that you want. But that is directly a result of the work that we engaged in. And it can be maddening because it seems like, you know, not a lot of improvement if you think of it as an improvement, but that is the work that you do when you engage in that.
My question is for Mr. Go. Would you mind me asking you what's your ethnic background? I always assume Michelle was Chinese. But I don't know whether you're Korean or not. And in Mr. Lee's case, he seemed to be Korean. Now, I'm asking that is because, you know, I wonder whether there is some resentment within the Asian community itself, I mean, among certain groups. Do you feel bad because you are mistaken for Chinese and got attacked? And I think in the Vincent Chin case that we remember, he was mistaken for a Japanese auto worker. So I think that that sense of unity has to be there in order for us to go forward. And now number two, because I just saw, I mean, I'm asking you, but, you know, not asking the other people because you just voted. Now,
Future voter. Future
yeah,
voter.
you know, but there is so much going on in this race, the mayoral race. I mean, so law and safety is uppermost on a lot of people's mind, and I think for us Asians. You know, I have myself, I'm a filmmaker. I made a film about an interracial murder inspired by a case in the late 80s. It was also a Chinese woman being pushed on the subway track, but by a white Italian-American guy. But then, you know, that was kind of, you know, alone out there and not really picked up. And then people were very puzzled by that film. And then, of course, you know, 30 years later, I mean, I'm teaching now at Prague and show it to my student, Chinese and Asian student. They were all, you know, taken aback. And, you know, so
why don't we let Mr. Go answer the question?
Yeah.
Thank you for your questions. I wasn't sure about your second question there. Just to answer your first question, as I understood it, I am second generation Chinese American. My parents were from a small village in Guangzhou. My father came out here first in the, I think in the 30s and 40s, and then after there was some inclusion with Taiwan in World War II, then my mother was allowed to come to the States. So I am second generation, and I am, quote, pure Chinese. Again, I am not too sure of what your second question was. I kind of heard some of it, so I'm not sure what to answer.
I mean, if I could kind of come in, I mean, it's talking about Asian American unity.
Yes.
And about how because Chinese or China and Chinese people were blamed, now other Asians are getting wrapped up into sort of the backlash. You know, Koreans, Filipinos. And I think the Asian American movement's answer to that is to say, hey, we might be different, but the way that we are perceived within society with these negative backlashes is all the same. So, you know, you've got to make that jump in your mind from saying, I'm not like that, but you might experience that anyway. And so, yeah.
I was going to say, like, I was going to jump in. I think the difference is actually social economic rather than by race. So, like, I went to Harvard, and when these attacks started happening, we needed people to help oversee, like, the GoFundMe money, for example, for some of the victims who were undocumented. And I called up every Harvard friend I have who's in finance. I didn't find Michael, but and nobody wanted to jump in. In fact, Judge Go very willingly kind of acted as trustee for a little while for one of the victims. But it was extremely difficult to find people who lived in the ivory tower with the paradigmatic, like, Asian American success story, people who had, like, great jobs and, you know, kind of the Michelle Goes of the world to come in. And unlike her, they were not willing to come in because they saw risk in working with Asian Americans. Not so much they were Chinese or Korean or Filipino, but more that they were people who were undocumented or poorer, and we saw risk in that. So that's something we need to grapple with in our own community of why we kind of perceive that, or maybe there's safety once you have a perceived social class or economic class, that you don't reach out and say, hey, look, we're all the same. And I think anti-Asian hate does treat us all the same. It doesn't matter how much money is in your bank account.
Let's have some other questions. Thanks. There'll be time to talk later.
Well, first, thank you all for addressing this really, really important topic. I think very personal for probably all of us here. Question for Glenn, Chris, and Jennifer. You mentioned earlier you want all of us to engage. And when you ask about how many people harassed, how many people actually reported, right? The less and less people report. What is really the right steps or actions if something happened to us to take? I was personally harassed, and I reported, and I waited until the police report came out. I was going to persecute, but then I was advised not to because it didn't make sense. And I searched all the internet to find resources. I called a lawyer in, I think, Nevada. I tried, but I don't know what's really the right steps to actually make a voice.
Yeah, I think the first step is to call Asian American Bar Association of New York, the task force. That's easy. Young is sitting right here. But I think you need the weight of the community to push that forward. The whole reason that I was, as a patent lawyer, being asked to do this is people felt that they wouldn't get the prosecution that they wanted unless there was a voice out there. I happened to be at that point, a very powerful law firm, Paul Weiss. The people who were at Paul Weiss were Jewish and black. My mentor was Loretta Lynch, who was Obama's attorney general. And so she was able to call up Alvin Bragg and say, I want you to take this seriously. We've supported you for years, now support the Asian community. So one is to have political power, obviously. And if you don't have political power, call up Asian American Bar Association of New York to get that power. We have to stand together. The second is that the NYPD has, if it's in New York, there's this, there's a detective called Danny who I text all the time with these issues because he can basically look into it and get the police report, and he's on the hate crime task force for them. So he can make sure he shepherds it, and he's Chinese American, and he was often first on the scene. He's the one who's shepherding a lot of these victims around if they don't feel safe. The same was true in Westchester. For the Filipino woman, there was actually an Irish American NYPD person who shepherded them around. So part of it is to actually, in my view, trust the institutions that are supposed to seek justice and build those connections by leaning in. Like, we bring cookies to our NYPD and FDNY people all the time from our family. Do we need to do that? No. Do I think it's good for my kids to feel like it's not us versus them? Yes. Do I agree with NYPD and FDNY on everything? No, but I think it's good to be part of that community. And I try very hard to show up for every other community. Like, I went to Jewish gala last night. I went to the NAACP LDF dinner 2 weeks ago. But if we don't show up for other people, they won't show up for us. And I guess one question to ask yourself is, how many of you have been showing up for our Black, Muslim, Jewish, LGBT brethren who've been experiencing hate crimes in enormous numbers in the past year? And if you haven't been giving money and you haven't been showing up to galas, that might be a reason that when we get hurt, people think we're invisible. Like, I know for a fact in the Buffalo shooting, that was kind of an anti-Black shooting, that ADL, which is the anti-Semitic kind of organization, Scott Richmond showed up, was first on the scene. There was not a single Asian American there, and I got a call about it saying, why are there no Asian Americans there? And it might be just bandwidth. We don't have the resources, but there's enough people in New York City that we should care about our neighbors, regardless of what they look like when they suffer a hate crime. So that's kind of my individual kind of pitch, to kind of be part of, I saw 3 rabbis last night. I talked to all of them about anti-Asian hate. They told me about anti-Semitism, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I want to chime in on that, especially at the political level of allyship. I was here during 9/11, and I was working at ALDEF at the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. Back then we were actually doing more anti-Asian violence work. And when we saw South Asians, Arabs, and Muslims being attacked, we were so proud of the Japanese community who came out and stood up and said, we see what is happening to Arabs, Muslims, South Asians post 9/11, and this we will not stand for it. And I was really proud when COVID hit that Deepa Iyer and a number of South Asian activists said, we need to stand up for the Asian American Chinese community. But it was hard because I also felt some people said, oh, thank God I'm not Chinese. They can't tell the difference. You're Korean. Or, thank God I'm not like yellow. And I think it's those things where we need to understand that there is an interrelationship between our communities, that our money and success is not sufficient. And that's actually one of the things that I actually am really proud of, that I am so sad that we had deaths and people who died to be able to come to this awakening. But the reality is that we needed that to mobilize a community, to have a strong bar association, to have groups like TAF who are realizing we need to speak out. We understand that the nail that stands up sometimes gets beat down, but we may get beat down anyway. We should stand up and speak out for our community. So I'm so proud of what is happening in New York. I work at the federal level, and I'll tell you, I don't have to do work in New York because of the people that are here. I'm trying to deal with New Hampshire. I'm trying to deal with Kansas and those really insular places where there is nobody who is speaking out for our community. And I feel sad because I'm from New York, so I feel I really should be doing more. But I am so proud of the work of Abney. I'm so proud of the work that Jennifer and that Chris, you all have doing. And I'm so proud of all of you for standing up and saying things. I have spoken to some other victims, and they don't want to say anything. They just want it to go away. And it does take courage.
Very brave.
To stand up.
Right.
So I thank you for standing up for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you to the survivors for sharing your story, for bearing witness, for letting us put it out there so that we can remember and then be spurred to action. So thank you so much. And we're going to go to the reception afterwards and answer any other questions that might be out there. So thank you so much.